There is a question at the center of this story that I need you to sit with before anything else. Not a rhetorical question, not a philosophical one designed to make you feel something before the narrative starts. A genuine question about a real choice made by a real person on a real morning in September 1940. The question is this: if you knew beyond any reasonable doubt that a place existed where human beings were being systematically murdered, and if you also knew that nobody on the outside fully understood what was happening inside, and if you believed that the only way to change that was to go inside yourself, to voluntarily surrender your freedom and enter that place, carrying a false identity and a hidden purpose, with no guarantee that you would ever come out again, and with every statistical probability suggesting you would not, would you do it? Most people, when they encounter this question, reach for the honest answer, which is no. Of course not. Nobody would do that. Nobody could do that. The self-preservation instinct is too strong. The fear is too rational. The odds are too bad. No reasonable person would walk into a death camp on purpose. Witold Pilecki was not unreasonable. He was a 39-year-old Polish cavalry officer, a farmer, a husband, a father of 2 children, a man who enjoyed painting and writing poetry in the years before the world collapsed. He was not a fanatic. He was not suicidal. He was not, by any account of the people who knew him, a person who did not value his own life. He raised his hand anyway. On the morning of September 19th, 1940, carrying a false identity card that identified him as a man named Tomasz Serafiński, a tanner by profession, Witold Pilecki positioned himself deliberately in the path of a German roundup operation in the Zalaborz neighborhood of Warsaw. He could have hidden. He knew where safe hiding places were. He chose not to use them. He waited to be taken. He was taken. He was beaten with rubber truncheons for 2 days in an old cavalry barracks, while the Germans processed the 2,000 Poles they had swept up in the operation. And then, on the night of September 21st to 22nd, 1940, he was loaded onto a train and transported to a camp on the outskirts of a Polish town called Auschwitz. The Germans called it Auschwitz. They gave him a number. It was tattooed on his left forearm. Number 4,859. From that moment forward, to everyone in that camp who did not know his secret, he was not Witold Pilecki. He was not even Tomasz Serafiński. He was a number. One of thousands of numbers in a system designed, with deliberate and comprehensive efficiency, to ensure that the people inside it understood themselves to be nothing more than that. He had walked into this system on purpose. He was the only person in the documented history of Auschwitz ever confirmed to have done so voluntarily. He would spend 2 years, 7 months, and 6 days inside it. What he saw, what he built, what he reported, and what the world chose to do with those reports is one of the most extraordinary and one of the most painful stories of the entire Second World War. To understand why Pilecki made the decision he made, you need to understand what Poland looked like in the autumn of 1940 and what the Polish resistance knew and did not know about Auschwitz. The Nazi invasion of Poland had begun on September 1st, 1939. The Soviet invasion from the east had followed on September 17th. Within weeks, the country that had existed as an independent state for barely 2 decades, having been reconstituted after the First World War following more than a century of partition, had been carved up between 2 totalitarian powers and had ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. The occupation that followed was unlike anything that had been imposed on Western European countries that the Nazis also conquered. In France, in the Netherlands, and Belgium, the German occupation was brutal and oppressive, but it operated within a framework that included some nominal preservation of local institutions and some degree of day-to-day civilian life. In Poland, the Nazis made no such accommodation. Poland was not a country to be occupied and administered. It was a territory to be emptied. The Polish intelligentsia, the educated professional class, the military officers, the priests, the teachers and lawyers and doctors, were to be systematically eliminated to prevent the emergence of any organized Polish leadership that might resist. The Polish working class was to be enslaved. The Jewish population was to be annihilated. This was the world in which the Polish Home Army, the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe, was operating in 1940. And in the summer and autumn of that year, disturbing reports were beginning to reach the resistance about a camp that the Germans had established in a former Polish military barracks in the southern town of Auschwitz. The camp was called Auschwitz. Poles were being taken there. What happened to them once they arrived was not fully understood. The resistance needed someone inside. Witold Pilecki was 39 years old. He was a veteran of the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921, a conflict that had ended with Poland's remarkable defensive victory at the Battle of Warsaw, a battle that military historians have described as one of the most significant in European history for its role in stopping the westward advance of Bolshevist revolution. He had farmed land in eastern Poland between the wars, raised a family, maintained his connection to the Reserve Officer Corps. When the Germans invaded, he had gone immediately to Warsaw and joined the underground. He was exactly the kind of person the resistance needed for a mission of this nature. Experienced, disciplined, capable of maintaining a false identity under sustained pressure, and willing. He stood in front of the roundup. He was taken. The first thing Auschwitz did was strip away everything. Not just clothing, though that too. Every object, every piece of paper, every item that connected a human being to a life outside the wire was confiscated. Names were replaced with numbers. Civilian clothing was replaced with a striped uniform. Heads were shaved. The process of dehumanization was physical before it was psychological, a deliberate sequence designed to interrupt the internal experience of selfhood that allows human beings to resist. Then the beatings started. Pilecki described the arrival in his later report with the specific precision of a man who understood that what he was recording needed to be believed by people who had not been there. The guards' whips. The German shepherd dogs trained to attack. The running, the shouting, the systematic application of violence to people who had not yet understood that this was the baseline, not an exception. New prisoners were beaten not because they had done anything wrong, but because the beating was the introduction. It was the first lesson. You are nothing here. You have no rights here. What happens to your body is not yours to determine. He had chosen this. He was there on purpose. And the thing that Pilecki would later describe, in the understated language that characterized everything he wrote about Auschwitz, was that nothing he had imagined about what the camp would be matched what it actually was. The intended prisoner lifespan at Auschwitz in 1940 was estimated at approximately 42 days. The combination of starvation rations, forced labor in all-weather conditions, violence from guards, disease in the overcrowded barracks, and deliberate execution meant that a new prisoner who arrived without connections, without protection, without some form of internal support network, was unlikely to be alive 6 weeks later. Pilecki survived his first 6 weeks, and then he began to build. The network he created inside Auschwitz was called the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, the Union of Military Organizations, or ZOW. He built it on the cell structure that resistance organizations use specifically to limit the damage that a single arrest or a single act of betrayal can do. Each member knew the identities of only the people in their immediate cell. The structure above them was known only to Pilecki and his immediate lieutenants. If the Germans broke one cell, the information its members could provide under torture was limited to the few people they personally knew. The cells served multiple functions. They shared food. In a camp where starvation was a deliberate instrument of control, the systematic redistribution of even small amounts of additional food among network members made a measurable difference to survival rates. They shared information. They maintained morale. They told each other what was happening in different parts of the camp, on different work details in different barracks, and they gathered the specific data that Pilecki had come inside to gather. Smuggling information out of Auschwitz required finding people who were leaving. Some prisoners were released after their sentences were served. In the early period of the camp's operation, when it still functioned partly as a detention facility for Polish political opponents rather than a pure death camp. Some were transferred. Some managed to escape. Pilecki cultivated these channels with the patience and the care of someone who understood that each one was fragile and might close at any moment. The first report reached Warsaw in October 1940, carried by a young Polish officer named Alexander Wielopolski, who had memorized its contents because writing anything down would have been too dangerous. Wielopolski delivered it orally to the resistance command in Warsaw. It described conditions in the camp with a specificity and a credibility that oral testimony from anonymous sources could not have provided. It described the systematic violence, the starvation, the arbitrary executions, the scale of the operation. It was among the first systematic accounts of Auschwitz available to anyone outside occupied Poland. From Warsaw, the reports were passed to the Polish government in exile in London. From London, they were shared with the British government and with American intelligence. The reports described mass executions. They described the conditions in which tens of thousands of people were being worked and starved and beaten to death. They described what was happening to the Jews of Poland with a specificity that no document produced outside the camp could have matched. And the response was silence. Not because the reports were disbelieved exactly. They were read. They were filed. They were assessed. But the Allied command in 1942 and 1943 was fighting a war on multiple fronts with finite resources and clear strategic priorities. The bombing of the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, an operation that Pilecki and the Polish resistance repeatedly and desperately urged, was assessed against the cost in aircraft and crews of diverting bombers from other targets. The conclusion, reached in offices in London and Washington by men who were not in Auschwitz and could not fully imagine what it meant to be there, was that the diversion was not justified by the strategic value of the target. The bombers flew over Auschwitz on their way to other targets. They flew directly over it. Photographs taken from Allied aircraft showed the camp clearly. The chimneys of the crematoria were visible in those photographs. The trains kept running. By 1942, the nature of what Auschwitz had become was changing in ways that transformed the moral stakes of every decision made by the people who had the power to act. Following the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the ideological program of the Third Reich had accelerated toward its most extreme expression. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 formalized what had already begun in practice. The final solution: the systematic, industrial-scale murder of every Jewish person in Europe. Auschwitz became the centerpiece of this program. The existing camp, now called Auschwitz I, was supplemented by a vastly larger facility 2 kilometers away at Birkenau, designated Auschwitz II. Birkenau was not a concentration camp in the sense that the world had been using the term. It was an extermination facility. It was designed for one purpose: the efficient, large-scale killing of human beings who arrived by train, were processed on the platform through a selection conducted by SS doctors who decided with a glance who would work and who would die immediately, and were then either sent to the gas chambers or held to be worked to death over a longer period. By mid-1942, Pilecki understood what he was inside. He had seen the transports arriving. He had gathered the testimony of prisoners across multiple work details about what was happening at Birkenau. He had cross-referenced accounts, verified details, converted individual observations into the kind of systematic reporting that decision-makers could use. He had also understood, with the slow and terrible clarity that only comes from being present, that the uprising he had hoped to organize from inside the camp was not possible. The scale of the operation, the number of guards, the physical infrastructure of the camp, the systematic destruction of prisoner capacity for collective action, the ongoing selections that removed from the population anyone who showed signs of strength or leadership or organization, made the kind of resistance he had envisioned in 1940 impossible in 1943. He had one option left. He had to get out. Not to say himself. To be able to speak in person to the people who needed to hear what he had seen. To carry the testimony of Auschwitz in a form that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. To be the man who had been inside and had come out alive. The escape was planned over months. It required the cooperation of the work detail structure and of the camp administration that governed which prisoners were assigned to which tasks. Pilecki and two fellow members of his network, Jan Redzig and Edward Shishelsky, managed to get themselves assigned to a night shift at a camp bakery that was located outside the main perimeter fence. The bakery was secured, but its security was not the multiple layers of wire and watchtowers that surrounded the main camp. It was a door. On the night of April 26 to 27, 1943, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the three men overpowered the guard at the bakery door. They cut a telephone line to prevent immediate alarm. They moved through the darkness. Shots were fired behind them. Pilecki later wrote about the running with the specific, exhausted clarity of a man describing something that happened to his body rather than something he chose to do. How fast we were running, he wrote, it is hard to describe. We were tearing the air into rags by quick movements of our hands. They ran through the night. They reached a river and swam across it. They moved through forest and farmland for several days, sustained by food from sympathetic Polish farmers, before reaching the safety of a resistance contact network. Witold Pilecki had spent 947 days inside Auschwitz. He had arrived as a voluntary prisoner, carrying a false identity and a hidden purpose. He had built a resistance network that at its peak included several hundred members across multiple camp sections. He had sent out reports that had reached London, Washington, and the Vatican. He had survived beatings, pneumonia, exhaustion, and the constant risk of discovery. And he had done all of this in a place where the intended lifespan of a new prisoner was 6 weeks. He was alive. He reached the Resistance Command and reported in person on everything he had seen. He compiled his most comprehensive account of Auschwitz over the following months, a document that has been published in English as the Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery, and which remains one of the most important primary source documents from the Holocaust. He argued again, urgently, for the bombing of the camp's infrastructure and the railway lines feeding it. He described the gas chambers. He described the selections. He described the scale of what was happening at Birkenau. The Allied command did not bomb Auschwitz. In August 1944, Pilecki participated in the Warsaw Uprising, the massive effort by the Home Army to liberate the Polish capital as Soviet forces approached from the east. The uprising was a military catastrophe. Stalin, who wanted post-war Poland under communist control rather than governed by the Home Army or the government in exile, ordered Soviet forces to halt their advance and wait while the Germans crushed the uprising. 60,000 Polish fighters and 200,000 civilians died. When the Germans were finished, they systematically demolished what remained of Warsaw block by block. Pilecki fought through it. He was captured near the end of the uprising and spent the final months of the war in a German prisoner of war camp, where he was liberated by American troops on April 29, 1945. He was free. The war was over. He had survived Auschwitz, the Warsaw Uprising, and 2 German prison camps. He was 43 years old. He had a wife and 2 children who were alive. He could have stopped. He did not stop. The post-war settlement of Europe had replaced Nazi occupation of Poland with Soviet domination. The government that now controlled Warsaw was a communist administration aligned with Moscow, not the Polish government in exile that Pilecki had served. He looked at what had replaced the Nazi occupation and saw, with the clarity of someone who had spent his entire adult life fighting foreign domination of Poland, another version of the same thing. Poland was not free. It was subservient to a different power. And that power needed to be documented and resisted just as the previous one had been. He returned to Poland in December 1945 under an assumed name to gather intelligence on the communist regime for the government in exile. He documented the crimes of the Soviet-backed security services. He documented the falsification of the 1946 referendum results that were supposed to determine Poland's post-war political direction. He built another network. He ran another intelligence operation. He was warned repeatedly that his cover had been compromised, that the communist security services knew who he was. That staying was likely to be fatal. He stayed. On May 8, 1947, he was arrested by the Polish security police. What followed was almost a year of interrogation and torture that, by the account of those who saw him afterward, broke something that Auschwitz had not broken. He was 46 years old, and he had already endured more than almost any human being could be expected to endure. The communists understood that a man who had survived what he had survived without breaking was a particular kind of threat to their legitimacy, and they treated him accordingly. On March 3, 1948, a show trial was held. The outcome had been determined before the proceedings began. He was accused of espionage, of planning assassinations of communist officials, and of illegal border crossing. The charges relating to planning assassinations were later admitted by the communist authorities themselves to have been fabricated. He was not permitted to call witnesses in his defense. He was found guilty on all counts. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was shot in the back of the head at Mokoto prison in Warsaw. He was 47 years old. The man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz to bear witness and was told by the world that his witness was noted but not actionable, who had escaped and fought and reported and returned and been arrested, was killed not by the regime he had spent 4 years fighting from inside one of its death camps, but by the regime that came after it. Killed by Poles in a Polish prison, because the Poland that existed in 1948 was not the Poland he had given everything to preserve. His family was persecuted. His wife worked as a cleaner at a Catholic orphanage. His children grew up under the shadow of a father the state had officially declared a traitor. The name Witold Pilecki was erased from Polish public life for 4 decades. In 1990, after the fall of communism, he was posthumously exonerated. In 2006, he was posthumously awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest state honor. Witold's report was published in full and translated into multiple languages. Jack Fairweather's biography, published in 2019 and titled The Volunteer, won the Costa Book Award and introduced his story to millions of readers who had never heard of him. Poland's chief rabbi, Michael Shudrich, wrote in the foreword to the English translation of Pilecki's Auschwitz report, "When God created the human being, God had in mind that we should all be like Captain Witold Pilecki, of blessed memory." The historian Norman Davies, in his introduction to the same translation, wrote, "If there was an Allied hero who deserved to be remembered and celebrated, this was a person with few peers. There is something specific about the failure to act on Pilecki's reports that needs to be understood clearly, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with and most important not to look away from. The reports that came out of Auschwitz between 1940 and 1943 were not vague. They were not ambiguous. They were not produced by people who might have been exaggerating or who might not have understood what they were seeing. They were produced by a trained military intelligence officer who was inside the camp, who cross-referenced his observations, who verified what he could, and who transmitted them through a chain that reached London and Washington in a form that was clearly marked as first-hand intelligence from a verified source. The SS guard who told Italian survivor Primo Levi, upon his arrival at Auschwitz in 1944, that however this war may end, we have won the war against you, because none of you will be left to bear witness, But even if someone were to survive, the world will not believe him was wrong about one thing. Someone did bear witness. Someone did survive long enough to tell it. The world was told. The world's response was to note the reports, file them, and decline to divert bombing resources from other targets. Witold Pilecki died believing he had failed to deliver his message. The Auschwitz he had walked into on purpose in September 1940 and that he had left behind in April 1943 continued to operate until January 1945, when Soviet forces liberated it. By then, more than 1 million people had been murdered there. He had not failed to deliver his message. He had delivered it precisely and completely and repeatedly. The failure was not his. That is the hardest thing in this story. Not the courage, though the courage is almost beyond comprehension. Not the suffering, though the suffering was real and sustained and ultimately fatal. The hardest thing is the gap between what one man was willing to do to make the world see what was happening and what the world was willing to do with the sight. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this story you cannot let go of. Tell me whether you think the Allies should have bombed Auschwitz. Tell me what you think the word hero means after you have heard what this man chose to do and what was done to him afterward. This is a story about human courage at its absolute limit and about human failure at exactly the same scale. It deserves to be known. Subscribe right now so you never miss a story like this one. Because there are people in history who did everything right and were failed by the world around them. And they deserve to be remembered properly.